Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the extra mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now your hosts, Jackson Mummy and Megan Saya from Celebration Bar Review.
Hey everybody, welcome. It is Wednesday, May 11th. So glad to have you all with us. We've got one more state to get results, and that's Georgia, but we did get California results this last week, and so we got a lot to talk about. Hi, Megan, how are you?
Hi, are we still waiting for New Jersey too? I feel like we're
waiting for New Jersey, you're right.
There's some other small ones, but I think we're still waiting for New Jersey as well. Yeah, another big one.
Is that like an existential play, waiting for New Jersey?
Yeah, they're keeping people hanging. Don't they normally release a little closer to New York?
They used to, but now who knows? The world has gotten crazy, no doubt about it. But we are here and we are excited to share the day with you. We're going to take some student questions. We're going to talk about results, some of the bar exam news, and then Megan and I are going to do a deep dive on criminal attempt. Fun topic, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one that tends to trip people up a bit. So hopefully this is really helpful for everyone.
Let's go ahead and jump into it, Megan. Kick us off, if you will.
All right, wonderful. Let's talk about results first. Before we get to California, I'm going to talk about the other states that we heard from this past week. So we got Alaska with 56% pass rate, Minnesota 63%, Rhode Island 40%. South Dakota, 55%. Maryland released results, but I don't have their percentage yet for overall takers. Kansas had a 68% pass rate. Montana with a 57% pass rate. Hawaii with a 67% pass rate. So really consistent with what we've been seeing across the board. Hawaii and Kansas were pretty high up there in those high 60s. We haven't seen a lot of that, but really pretty consistent with what we've been seeing from everyone. So let's turn to California. Whew, it was rough. So I definitely will own I was wrong. I thought it's going to be low because it's always low. It's California, but I didn't think it was going to be dramatically low for California. But California was a less than 34% pass rate. So first time applicants had a 53% pass rate. That's low, Jackson, for first-time applicants.
Yeah, it's not just low, it's a train wreck. I think that for all that California has said about trying to create a fair and level playing field on a test, this is not fair, and it is not a level playing field. And it is just absurd to me in a state the size of California that there were so few people who were admitted to the bar out of this test. And I thought it was also particularly interesting. I mean, it was what they said. It was a day of pure joy for 1,056 people. Yeah, in a state of millions, that's insane, first of all. But then they did something I have not ever seen in the press release from the Cal Bar. They started talking about everybody else. And what did you take of that, Megan?
Yeah. So what they did, which we were saying, I don't think I've ever seen any state do this, is that they sounded very defensive. So when they released the results, they noted nationally, at least a dozen other states saw their February 2022 pass rates drop from the previous year. And then they pointed to New York, Florida, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. They also noted, and I thought this was funny, they noted that the national average score on the MBE dropped to 132.6. Now that's really funny because as we talked about before, Jackson, a few weeks back, that's really been in line with the norm for the MBE. So the MBE was not particularly difficult this time. And it was really funny to me that it's almost like California was trying to say, oh, it wasn't our fault. The MBE was just really hard this year, when really it's the same as it's been very steady over the last several years.
Yeah,
so
I think they should be listening to our podcast more, don't you? I think that they clearly didn't get it, but this idea of trying to say, well, we're not so bad. Look at New York, look at North Carolina. Are you kidding me? Pennsylvania was a bizarre choice of things. Now, Florida, I could understand why they might want to use that. And all four of those states, New York, Florida, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, did have drops, as we've pointed out. But for California to lead with that before they ever got to their own statistics really says to me that they looked at those numbers and went, wow, this is not going to play well. And so they put that out. And I assure you, Florida does not ever talk about any other state's results when they release theirs. There are a lot of interesting things about California results, but one of the pieces that really stood out to me was the repeat taker pass rate. It was remarkably 24%. And it meant that only 485 repeaters passed the exam. Now, I'm very pleased that we had quite a few, but it is insane to me that if you're a repeat bar taker, your odds were so low of passing on this exam. What did you think about that?
Yeah, it's the same thing that we've been seeing for so long from California. And I think what's really frustrating, and I do believe that it's frustrating to the Cal bar examiners as well, is that despite these stopgap measures to try to make these numbers a little higher, we're just not seeing that. Back in February of 2020, the pass rate was 26.8%, which really marked a low point for California. So that was a real wake-up call. I think that was the lowest that had been since like the 80s. It was just really catastrophic. And so the California examiners changed the cut score, dropped it down to 1390, in part hoping, I think, the band-aid of, hey, look, we've got to do something. Clearly we have to do something. This is supposed to be a test of minimum competency, not a test of prove that you're the most brilliant person in the room. So there's something wrong here. And I think what we're seeing with these scores is that even when they do these stopgap measures, it's just not enough. And so California is in the process of revamping their exam because, as we know, I know we talked about this, the MBE will be going away about 2025, 2026. And so even states that don't use the UBE will have to completely change their exam some way or another because they're not going to have the MBE. And so California has been working on how to make the exam more fair, to more accurately reflect the population of California, and has been working on ways to staunch the bleeding here. And unfortunately, there's no way for them to recognize the problem and immediately turn around for the next exam and fix it. This is a multi-year process. And so I think what's unfortunate is that we can expect to see low numbers from California until they move to the new exam, which is going to be several years from now. So people can't wait. And we do not advise our students to wait until there's a new exam because, of course, we also don't know with the new exam if it's going to get any better. That's the hope, but there's certainly no guarantees there.
Yeah, and I will say that in looking at results from our students and talking to students, we had students that got 30, 40, 50 point gains to pass the exam. We also saw students that got those gains and still didn't hit the 1390. And so it is possible to move your score up. I think one of the things that Megan, you and I have talked about is the value that we place at Celebration Bar Review on making our course accessible to that group of people who are generally underrepresented on the bar and who might not otherwise have the ability to get a comprehensive quality bar review for a state like California. I think if you're trying to challenge this exam on your own, you're in a tough world. And if you're a bar repeater, you're in an almost impossible situation. And so we have really worked hard to keep our course not only current and workable and useful, but affordable. And so if somebody's listening to this later and you're not enrolled in the course and you're thinking to yourself, how am I ever going to get through the exam? I'll just tell you that we have a terrific track record of being able to help California students and to do it in a way that's manageable from a budget standpoint, because we just think it's a question of equity, right? It's a question of equity and fairness.
Yeah, definitely. I will also want to point out, because California does break down the school type and the pass rates for the different school types. California is one of the few states where they do allow non-ABA accredited law schools in the state. And if you are someone who went to a California accredited or an unaccredited law school, I think you do need to hear these numbers to know what you're up against and how you really are. You've got to fight. You're going to have to fight really hard. You're going to have to give it everything you've got. In California, let me tell you, the California ABA, let's go with the repeat rate since that's most of our students. California ABA repeaters were only 33% pass rate. Out of state ABA accredited law schools was only 29% for repeaters. That's catastrophically low. But then when we jump down, California accredited law schools, repeaters were 14% pass rate. Unaccredited fixed facility, so that means there's a building, 15% for repeaters. Unaccredited correspondence, 12% for repeaters. Unaccredited distance learning, 6% for repeaters. So I just want to let people know, I'm not trying to scare you. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, but if you fall into one of those categories as a repeater, I think it's really important. And I know Jackson agrees that you guys walk into this with your eyes open. We don't want you to beat yourselves up. We don't want you to feel like, I have a lot going on, but I can halfway do it and it's probably going to be enough. The odds are stacked against you. And so we're going to do everything that we can on our end. And we would love to see you guys do everything you can on your end as well to help make it over this hump. But the reality is it's been real bad in California for a real long time. And unfortunately, it's not getting better in the next few years, at least.
Yeah. And if you want a little dose of encouragement, we just recorded an interview with one of our California repeat takers that did pass. And you can check that out on our case studies on our website. And the story that we did with John is really remarkable, and I think you'll find it inspiring. So we'll try and get more of those. It's not always easy to get people to agree to give these interviews, particularly when they've been failing the bar exam previously. So we are very appreciative for everyone that comes on and does an interview with us. I think we're close to 100 of those now, which is really remarkable. But in any event, check it out. All right, that's all I've got in California. I'm just going to go bury my head for a while, and we'll do what we got to do. And now we wait for New Jersey and Georgia.
Yeah, exactly. And I do want to say to anybody who failed California or any other jurisdiction this time around, please know that this test is very flawed. The NCBE recognizes that it's flawed and they are trying to fix it. And they will in a few years. They're going to completely revamp it. California acknowledges that it's flawed. They are trying to revamp it, which they will in a few years. So if you were unsuccessful, it is not a reflection of you. It is not a reflection of your intelligence. It is not reflective of your abilities as an attorney. Okay. So I don't want you to feel that internally. And if you are struggling with that, please go on to group coaching. Please sign up for mindset coaching with June. We want you to hold your head high and be proud of the work that you put in, because we see how hard all of you have been working. And so I just don't want anybody to walk away from this feeling like it says anything about who they are as a person, because it really doesn't. All right, let's turn to DC and Tennessee, Jackson, for this next upcoming July exam. I know we mentioned this with DC, but there's some news out of Tennessee similar, that they are capping the number of applicants who can sit for the exam. So there's a lot of controversy being stirred up about this, but the bottom line, if you are planning to take the bar in DC or in Tennessee, you need to register. I don't know if it's going to be possible. I think DC is not even open yet to you unless you just graduated from a DC law school. That is being pushed back against nationally right now. There's a lot of chatter in the legal community about this, about potential constitutional violations with capping it and only allowing students who attended DC law schools to sit for the exam there, or functionally only allowing that because they reduce the seating capacity so it's very few people are going to be able to get in. With Tennessee, they just announced that they have reached seating capacity in, is it Memphis and Chattanooga? Is that their other two places? And I think they still have some seats left in Nashville. But interestingly, they said at this point, they can't guarantee if you've registered that you'll have a seat in Nashville. And if you register and they don't have a seat for you, you're going to get bumped to the next exam, which is obviously a long time from now. Next February is a really long way away. So if you have not yet registered in Tennessee and you are planning to do it in Tennessee, I would probably start looking at some other options, because I don't think you want to wait until next February, which is almost a year from now, to be able to sit. And you are definitely not guaranteed a seat. Even if you register and pay and everything, they are not guaranteeing that you're going to have a seat for the exam.
Yeah, and to be clear, at least in DC, the problem wasn't COVID. The problem was there was an anime convention that booked the hall that they've historically used. And I find it a little tough to believe that in Washington, D.C., there's not a room big enough to handle all the bar takers.
Or that they were that unable and unwilling to go to multiple locations, which is what many other states, including Tennessee, do. Yeah, very odd. It seemed like it was about, oh, this is the best we could do, so we'll just make it smaller. But yeah, not cool.
Yeah, and all of this started a couple of years ago with New York, when they said, we're not going to let anyone that's not a first-time taker sit in the exam. This is a very troubling trend to me, because now I think we're starting to see, when I see a jurisdiction like Tennessee suddenly say, whoops, we're out, I think what's happened is that door is opened by what New York did, and then DC does it. And I don't know. I think the advice that you just gave, Megan, is right. Register for the exam, wherever you are, get registered. If you were thinking, oh, I'll get around to it, don't get around to it. Get it registered. Get in there now, because it's crazy. I don't even know. So.
Yeah. When I wonder too, not every state publishes this kind of stuff, but like California, for instance, saw significantly fewer takers in the past couple of administrations than they have in the past. And I almost wonder if some of these places are like, some of these bar committees are like, we're expecting a smaller crowd than we normally have. So we'll just go ahead and book a smaller venue. And then, oh, surprise, we're getting more people. I would expect these July numbers to look more like they have historically. We seem to be past the stage of people maybe not wanting to sit for the exam or delaying things like that. And then there's some backlog, certainly from people who've pushed it back through COVID. So we might see
there's more people who failed.
Right. Yeah.
And
yes.
so if you're going to fail 60% of the bar takers, guess what? They got to take it again. They're going to show up. I mean, let's get real, folks. So anyway, I'm sorry. I get a little frustrated with these guys.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point, that there's just a lot of people who are having to take it over and over again. And so if they're thinking, oh, we'll save a little bit of money and we'll get a smaller spot, and then turns out that they get a whole lot more applicants than they thought they would. Yeah, that's a problem. So yes, no matter where you're taking it, please register today if you haven't registered yet, because that was a big surprise that happened in Tennessee. Tennessee is certainly not a state where they were concerned at all about COVID. This is purely about, hey, we underbooked, like we booked too small of venues for the number of people that we had. And it's very interesting to me that they are not opening up a fourth venue, but instead just saying when we're full. So please register today. If you have not registered yet for July, it's just not worth it to wait and find out that all the studying that you've done is for nothing, because you're not even going to be able to sit for the exam. Okay. All right. So let's shake all that off. I know that's a lot of bad, hard, difficult news, and I'm so sorry for that. All right. So a few student questions and notes, and then we're going to discuss the community group question that you posted this week, Jackson, which I think got some really interesting responses. All right. The student asked, they said, I'm taking too long to read the outlines, way too long because I'm a slow reader. What can I do?
Yeah, the first step is, I think you should photo read. That will get you through an outline in about 5 to 10 minutes. And it really works. So I encourage people to do that. But if for some reason you're not going to photo read, then the answer is to skim. It's to literally just force yourself to finish reading in that short period of time. And I know that people think if they go slower, they'll understand more. The studies are very clear, however, that it's exactly the opposite. The slower you go, the less you will comprehend. So when you slow down, and it could be because you've got dyslexia or ADHD, or you just think of yourself as a slow reader, the truth is the slower you go, the worse it's going to be. So just skim, and remember that we're going to repeat that material through the lecture and the question practice, and we're going to keep bringing the material back to you. So you don't have to overdo it. I call it the buffet approach. You don't have to put everything on your plate first time through. You can take a little bit and just keep moving. Do you have advice for that, Megan?
Oh, I 100% agree. I think that's a great analogy. I think people put too much pressure on themselves to feel like the first time through they have to know everything and remember everything and be experts in everything. The really good news is that's not the case. So good. That's a huge burden off your shoulders. Don't put that on yourself. We're not putting that on you. No one expects that of you. It's a long road from now until the exam, and you want to have this be a slow and steady sort of a situation. So do not burn yourself out by saying, gosh, I'm going to take 3 weeks and just work in one subject until I know that subject cold. You will be exhausted and you will probably give up. To be honest, it's just too much. That's too difficult. So yeah, don't put that pressure on yourself. All right. If this next question segues nicely, if a student decides to do photo reading, they want to know, how long is the class?
The course takes very little time. It's an hour a day for 8 days. And so what we recommend is that you start your day with the hour of photo reading lessons. These are lessons from Paul Sheely at Learning Strategies. And just as a segue, Paul reached out to me yesterday. He's doing a special MasterClass for his teachers on photo reading and the memory supercharger. And he invited me to participate in that. So I'm going to get a refresher myself. I'm excited about that. But in any event, 8 hours, 1 hour a day, and then you do your bar study during that same day. So you're not pushing your bar studies back by 8 days. You're just taking an hour out of each day to do the photo reading lessons and then integrating that into your study.
Great. And then one last photo reading question. Do the photo reading lessons teach you how to use photo reading for going through the text of the material on your laptop?
I don't know if they do, but I can do it here really quickly. It's exactly the same. You just put it up on your laptop, you look over the top edge of your laptop to the wall behind you, and that's enough to give you the soft focus. That's how I do all of my photo reading. It's all digital. It's all on my laptop. Although, gotta say, I got a 27-inch curved big monitor today, so I'm feeling big today. And I started photo reading on my 27-inch monitor. Wow, it's awesome. Anyway, I digress, but that's all you need to know. There's nothing different about photo reading digitally versus photo reading with hard copy. And don't make this complicated, folks. Don't get caught up in the weeds. Just flip the pages, whether you're flipping them manually or you're hitting page down. It's exactly the same process.
Wonderful. All right, so let's turn to our community group question. I thought there were some great responses to this week. So Jackson asked, what's one bar prep skill you'd like to perfect and why? So I broke them down into some different pieces here. And Jackson, maybe if there's a couple of small tips that you can give, obviously a lot of these are long-term skills that we work with students on individually and together as a group, but just maybe what are the quick and dirty tips that you would give people on this? So the first one up is essay timing and organization.
Yeah, the essay organization is simple. Take the call of the question, make that your main heading, then FLA, 3 paragraphs, 3 equals 3, 3, 3, 3, all the way through. If you're struggling with this, take Megan's personal writing workshop. She will show you how to set up an essay in FLA. I've been doing these interviews with successful bar students from around the country, whether it's UBE, Florida, California, and they all say, every one of them says FLA made the difference. So you've got to learn that style. The other thing is, from a timing standpoint, if you're just putting in the bare bones first, your headings and your FLA, 1 sentence each, and then go back and fill it in, you're never going to have a timing problem because you've got everything already in there. But if you start writing at the beginning with no idea where you're going to the next section and the next, then you're probably going to run out of time. So again, you can learn these skills in Megan's personal writing workshop. It is time and money well spent to really set that up. And if that's a challenge, that will be my recommendation.
Yeah. All right. And the next one is similar, but more broadly FLA writing, right? That the whole FLA style. And I think the answer is the same, which is if you're struggling at all with how to do FLA, please do not do it on your own. Do the personal writing workshop. I will break it down step by step, literally. I will give you very clear and simple direction to follow for how to do it. Then beyond that, I think you should do coaching with Jackson or with myself, because we will work with you on your writing continuously over the next several months to help refine and grow what you're already capable of. So those are my two pitches for FLA. All right. Next, I liked this one. Not overthinking the writing. That was a really good one. You hear that more with MBE questions, right? People overthinking the answers to an MBE question, but not overthinking the writing.
Yeah, it's a really good one. When I created the FLA writing system, and by the way, somebody told me the other day that there's someone that's teaching it. And I said, I'm the person that created it. Go to the source. But when I created it with the idea that you might not know very much law, this was well before photo reading and some of the other things. And so I built it on this concept of if you use the facts would naturally lead you to the arguments and the arguments would lead you to the law. And I think that's really part of what this is about, is you don't need to overthink it. You just want to be reactive. Now, if you're a photo reader, and even if you're not, if you've been using mind maps, then it should be intuitive to you. You should be able to paraphrase the argument or paraphrase the law based on the argument you're writing. And that's the whole point, is that we're pushing you down the funnel so that you get to that spot. And the only problem is when you stop and say, what law have I memorized? And then it's like Wile E. Coyote running off the side of the mountain. He runs great, and then he looks down, and what happens? He falls. The moment you start saying to yourself, what are the rules or the elements? What did I memorize? It's you can hold up the sign because you're going down.
Yeah, I think that's really tied to timing as well, right? Is that if you are stopping to force the law out of your head, you are wasting time. You want it to be, it flows naturally, right? You're reading the question and you just know from these facts, oh, this kind of a problem is being presented to me, and therefore this is how I'm going to analyze it. And you just go ahead and do it as opposed to stopping and going, okay, let me wait, remember there was that thing and what was that term? And I know it's in there somewhere. That's valuable time, especially in a 30-minute UBE essay that you just can't waste. All right, next I'm going to group a couple of these together. There were a few that were about doing the MBE quickly and correctly, and also how to use your intuition, follow your intuition, trust that in the process, and not fall back on that human nature thing, right? Of second guessing ourselves and going, well, I probably don't have that right.
Yeah, I want to because I just did the interview, Amanda makes this really interesting point. Now, this is somebody that scored a 168 on the MBE. Okay, so this is good. And she's got ADHD. And she finished the exam, the MBE, in 2 hours and 15 minutes for each section of 100 questions. And of course, she was the first one out of the room. And people said, well, how can you do that with ADHD? And she said, when I go faster, it forces me to stay at 90 seconds and not overthink the problem. And that clearly worked for her. She also had a great idea, which was use a little egg timer that's set at 90 seconds. So you just flip the timer when you're practicing. I thought that was good. One thing I would point out, Megan, you and I have been doing these deep dives every week, and we've got them all built into the course for those of you that are in the Celebration Bar Review course, and we sell them externally if you're not in our course. But these are an opportunity not only to learn the law of these difficult topics, but we do 2 or 3 questions each time in which we model selective intuition. And I think it's a great way to get a feeling for that and start practicing it. We don't have time today to walk through selective intuition, but I think that the more you use it in practice, the better it will be for you on the exam, don't you?
Yes, I think definitely. And that's part of why what we do when we go through these questions is we tell you how we're thinking about them. And of course, when we think about them, that happens a lot quicker than as we're explaining it out loud, but hopefully it gives you a good understanding, or at least a little bit of a better understanding of, okay, how do I want to approach an MBE question when I come to it? So that being said, Jackson, let's turn to our MBE topic for the day, which is attempt.
We are now talking about the study questions that keep you awake. And as we've been going through this series, we've taken on a number of difficult topics. Today, I think we've got a fun one to talk about. And it's how do I apply the attempt rules in criminal law questions? And this tends to trip people up, doesn't it, Megan? They really get fouled up because there's a lot of nuance here.
There is, right? And I think this is a great example of where overthinking can be your downfall if you start to play mind games. I did it with one of these questions when I was reviewing it earlier this week, that I was going, gosh, wait, but it could be X, but then maybe Y, because actually X makes more, oh no, but then this. And so we're going to talk through how do we sort of avoid that in something that can be very tricky, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to start, as we always do, with a broad mind map. And by the way, this is now available in your course. And if you've got BarMaps, we put it in there as well, and you can work with it and modify it. But this is a section of the criminal mind maps, and it's on attempt. And this is the overview, and I'm going to go through it in a little more detail, but I wanted you to just see that we've really got 5 categories that we're going to talk about. And so I want to jump into those. When we start with attempt, we begin with the definition and also the concept of merger. And what we're talking about here is that an attempt is a substantial step in which you have an intention to commit the crime and the apparent ability to complete the crime. Now, that's important because you've got to have those elements in there in order to have an attempt that occurs. So think about it this way: substantial step, intention, and an ability to complete the crime. We're going to see how merger plays out in just a minute, but I wanted you to get those definitions in place. Now, the important distinction, I think, to make, and it's not easy to say, so I'm going to try and get it right. We are going to be comparing preparation versus perpetration. Oh my gosh, could they make it any more difficult? And I want to look at that in some detail. Here's the first thing we need to know about preparation versus perpetration. If an activity is not an attempt, then we call it a preparation step, okay? And if an attempt is present, then it's perpetration. So keep that in mind. If there is not an attempt, it's only preparation, but if there's an attempt, it's perpetration. Now, how do you figure that out? One of the things is you look at how close in time, what's the proximity to the execution of the plan? And then you ask, were all the acts of the crime completed by the defendant? That's where merger comes in. And then you can ask yourself, well, what about outside interference? And the outline goes into some detail about examples of that. We're going to look at some things here in a minute, but outside interference is certainly part of perpetration versus preparation. But then, interestingly enough, you also have to evaluate the seriousness of the crime. The more serious the crime, perpetration will start earlier. So if you're going to do a really bad thing, then we start going way back in time to see where perpetration begins. Can preparation be a separate crime? The answer is no. It's statutory only. So unless the examiner's told you you're in a jurisdiction in which they've got a statutory crime for preparation, it is not a separate crime. So something to keep in mind. Now, what about this idea of an intent that's necessary to commit the attempt? So intent necessary to commit attempt. You must intend to commit that's a given and it's important. And the second thing is you don't need to know that your intended acts are criminal. So again, I think, Megan, this is where you're talking about you can overthink it, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So this is where mens rea, I think, can be tricky for people just in regular crim law, but certainly when we start getting into the attempt of a crime, it gets real confusing, or it can get real confusing for people of, gosh, what was the actual intention behind the person's actions there?
Yeah. And so that's why we're going to do these questions so you can see how it plays out, because it's hard as a concept, I think, for people to gather. All right, so then we want to look at something the examiners like to test, which is the defense of impossibility. And we're going to do an impossibility question. Not that the question is impossible, just the crime might be impossible. So you need to understand that there are four levels of impossibility. The first is factual, the next is inherent, the third is legal, and then there's a mistake of fact that results in legal impossibility. So those are our four categories. Now, if you have factual impossibility, that is not a defense to the crime, and the defendant is guilty of attempt. So get that in your head. A factual impossibility is not a defense, and you're guilty of attempt. What if you have an inherent impossibility? And we'll flesh that out as we go through the questions. If you're obviously incapable of bringing the intended act to fruition, to perpetration, then you're not guilty of attempt. So if you can't do it, you're not guilty of attempt. And I think our outline talks about somebody that said that they were going to shoot down an airplane with a bow and arrow. I don't think you can do that. And then there's legal impossibility. And this is where the defendant thinks they're committing a crime, but the act actually isn't a crime. So this is where your brain just gets wrapped around and you go, oh, what does that mean? But if the defendant thinks they're committing a crime, but the fact pattern tells you that the act is not a crime, the defendant is not guilty of attempt. So it's a nice, clean way to think of it. When you see it in the mind map, it's really helpful. And then you've got a situation in which there's a mistake of fact, which would result in a legal impossibility. And in that situation, you treat it the same as a legal impossibility. That is, the defendant is not guilty of an attempt. So I know that's mind-bending, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So you've got legal impossibility, meaning that I think I'm doing something wrong, but it's actually not a crime, then I'm not guilty. But if I'm doing something that I don't even realize is wrong, but it is a crime, that can be held guilty. So yeah, it's a confusing thing you want to make sure you get straight.
And hence the reason we're discussing it today. All right. And then one last category of this subject, which is abandonment, when you give up on the crime. If it's before a substantial step has been taken, and that obviously has to be defined, but if there's no substantial step, there's no attempt. However, if you progress back to perpetration, remember we talked about that earlier, then there is an attempt, and you can't use an involuntary abandonment after that point as a defense. In other words, I'm in the crime, I'm perpetrating it, but suddenly I realize there's a cop standing out there and I don't want to go forward. That's not involuntary abandonment, so there's no defense for that. Then the model penal code allows for a truly voluntary abandonment as a defense. But again, you have to be given that within the fact pattern. So not something you typically see. But again, remember that with abandonment, it's really when it happens. If it's before a substantial step, there's no attempt. But if you've gone past that into perpetration, then there is an attempt. All right, so now we're going to take some questions and work through them because I think it really helps to see it in context. So our first question, I'll read it for those of you that are not able to follow along. The crime of burglary in state X has been extended to all buildings in all hours of the day or night. Barbara entered the Shop and Save supermarket in State X to do her weekly grocery shopping and to steal some expensive steaks. She put bread and milk in her shopping basket and then went to the meat department, picked up a package of steaks, and put them in her coat pocket. When she was standing in the checkout line, the manager approached her and said, "I know you have a package of steaks in your pocket. If you'll pay for them, I'll forget about it, but if I ever catch you again, I will turn you over to the police." Barbara then paid for the steaks as well as the bread and milk. Now, the question, if the manager changes his mind and criminal charges are brought against Barbara, the most serious crime listed in order of seriousness of which she can be found guilty is. All right, now, this is one where you're not going to get a binary yes or no. And so you have to start thinking about it, right? Before you even start looking at the answer choice.
I would think in my head real briefly what crime you think she's committed.
Yeah, and I see the word burglary in the first sentence, so I'm thinking about burglary, and then I have to think a little bit about larceny, and then I have to think about attempt, because we've just been talking about attempt. So what is it? She doesn't finish the crime, so what happens? So now let's look at the answer choices. If the manager changes his mind and criminal charges are brought against Barbara, the most serious crime listed in order of seriousness of which she can be found guilty is A, burglary, B, larceny, C, attempted larceny, or D, no crime. All right, now we'd like those of you that are with us live to type in the chat box A, B, C, or D, and we want you to use your selective intuition here. We've just shown you very briefly what attempt is about. You may have studied crim, so maybe something about burglary or larceny, but where do you want to go with this? And I think this is a really good type of question to be looking at, don't you, Megan? Because it really forces us into thinking about all of this. Okay, all right, let's see what happens here. If you answered A, burglary, that's wrong. Barbara didn't break into the store, and so there can't be breaking when you enter the store open to the public. So hopefully nobody said A, even though that's the most serious crime. What about B? Those of you that said B, that's correct, because at the time that she picked up the steaks and intended to steal them, she'd committed all of the elements of larceny. And so this is where we get the concept of merger. The attempted crime merges into the substantive crime if the attempt was successful. The fact that she then paid for the steaks doesn't negate the elements of the crime. So this is where, Megan, you can overthink it, right?
Yes, I think this one would be really easy to overthink because she didn't actually leave the store with the steaks, or she wasn't successful. And so I think it could be really easy. And it's funny because I don't think anybody put C. So maybe you guys are more sophisticated than I am. But when I read this at first, I was like, okay, I think it's larceny. Gosh, but would it just be attempt because she didn't actually do it? And no, of course, because she actually hit all of the elements. You don't actually have to have been successful in your larceny to be able to be charged with stealing the steaks in this case.
You took the substantial step and it's now perpetration. So that's where it goes. If you answered C, attempted larceny, again, remember she committed all the elements of larceny, and so the attempt merges into the substantive crime if the attempt was successful. So hopefully you didn't get trapped with that. And if you said no crime, nope, that's wrong, because as soon as she picks up the steaks intending to steal them, she's now past preparation, she's into perpetration, all of the elements of larceny are there, and again, it merges into the substantive crime. So we have some smart people there, didn't we?
Yeah, that was great. Good job, guys.
All right, should we give them another question?
Yeah.
All right, let's go. Question number 2. I love this one. Maiden is the lead singer of a nationally known rock band. Natalie is an aspiring vocalist who frequents the same clubs. Apparently, Natalie is married to Howard, a prosperous businessman. When the band was planning a week's engagement at an out-of-town hotel, Maiden offered to take Natalie on the trip, let her stay in Maiden's hotel suite, and let her sing with the band. This is a weird question. Maiden promised Natalie a permanent position with the band if the audiences liked her. Maiden required that Natalie tell no one of the trip, not even Harold. In fact, however, Maiden had no intention of offering Natalie a permanent position with the band. One night, while Natalie was performing with the band in the hotel lounge, Maiden called Harold, told him that she had abducted his wife, and demanded $50,000 for her safe return. Harold arranged to drop the money at the designated spot the next evening. But as Maiden approached this pickup spot, she was arrested by the police. Natalie returned to the hotel suite after the show, unaware of Maiden's dealings with her husband. Whew. Got to write that one down, don't you? Who's Maiden, who's Natalie, who's Harold? It gets a little weird, but that's what we've got. So now the call to the question is Maiden is guilty of. So again, we've got to be thinking in advance what she might be guilty of.
You should be asking yourself, is there a problem with she told Harold that she abducted his wife. So we know in our head, we're going to have to answer for ourselves. Did she actually kidnap or abduct Natalie, given these facts? And then of course we've got this extortion. So we know in our heads, okay, was she guilty of attempt or actually extorting Harold?
Yeah. And then you've got the police, which they show up. And so she abandons the plan, but it's an involuntary abandonment after she's gotten fairly far along. So let's see what we got here. Maiden is guilty of A, attempted extortion only, B, attempted kidnapping and attempted extortion, C, kidnapping and attempted extortion, D, neither kidnapping nor attempted extortion. All right, now here's the way, if you've been using selective intuition, here's how you go down and become selective. I think the first thing that you look at, because you see kidnapping in 3 answers, the very first thing you have to decide, in my view, is was there a kidnapping, attempted or actual, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, 100%. That's what I would do.
Yeah, if you can make that distinction from the fact pattern about whether there was a kidnapping, this is going to make the answer choice for you, I think, a lot simpler. All right, let's see what we got here. A was the right answer. It's an attempted extortion only. And here's the reason. Maiden threatened Harold with future harm to Natalie, and it was for the purpose of obtaining Harold's property, and she took substantial steps towards the completion of the crime. So that gets us to the possibility of attempted extortion. But she's not guilty of either kidnapping or attempted kidnapping. And why? Natalie voluntarily went to the hotel room, even if she went there induced by misrepresentation, but she wasn't confined or restricted in her movement in any way. Remember, she was singing in the lobby and then she went back to the room. Since Natalie consented to the confinement, if you can call it that, there's no false imprisonment either, even though that wasn't part of the question. And therefore, Maiden can't be found guilty of kidnapping or attempted kidnapping. Once you know that, it's an easy answer, isn't it?
Yes.
And I'm not sure you've even got to understand attempted extortion. It's just the only one without kidnapping. So to me, that's how you answer the question quickly and move on. And I think this is where people sometimes start grinding and trying to figure out, well, what's the difference between B and C and D, when it's pretty obvious. You got 3 answers with one thing and one without it. Make that distinction and answer that in your mind, and you're probably going to be able to answer the question, right? Yeah. And so again, same thing here. B said attempted kidnapping, attempted extortion. It's not an attempted kidnapping. C says kidnapping and attempted extortion. Nope, not a kidnapping. You get the pattern. D said neither kidnapping nor attempted extortion. Now, here, I think you might have to do a little bit of thinking. Was there an attempted extortion? And the only way I think you get there is if you thought the fact she didn't complete the act. But remember, that's an involuntary abandonment, and that's not a defense. So we knew that when you've got a situation in which you've abandoned because there's someone else, like a cop, that shows up, that's not a defense, and you're going to be guilty of the attempt.
I think that's the not overthinking it piece too, right? It's funny because in this one, they don't even just say that a cop showed up. She was arrested.
Yeah,
So we certainly know that being arrested before you can complete the crime does not make you not guilty of the crime.
Yeah, so I'm not, how can I be guilty? You arrested me. No,
yeah,
exactly. Okay. So yeah, everybody got that. All right, let's do one final question. Question number 3. It's a good one. Freeman, who lived in a remote wilderness location, hated Scribe, a reporter for a regional newspaper. You remember newspapers, Megan? Who had commented unfavorably on some of Freeman's political activities. Freeman called Scribe, asked Scribe to visit his outpost to discuss their differences, and offered to let Scribe use Freeman's private plane, which was parked at an airport approximately 100 miles away from Freeman's home. Freeman altered the airplane so that it would crash about 50 miles from the airport on a wooded mountain. Scribe went to the airport, but the fog was so thick that the plane was not allowed to take off, and he therefore abandoned the trip. Now here's the question. If Freeman is charged with attempted murder, he will most likely be found what? And this is going to get us into impossibility, isn't it?
Yeah, I like questions like this. They're fun.
Yeah, it's fun. Remember, we've got 4 kinds of impossibility: factual, inherent, legal, and mistake of fact resulting in legal impossibility. So the first thing I think you want to ask yourself, it's going to be, we know the charge now is attempted murder, and we know that it doesn't happen. So what's the reason for it? And that's where you want to be thinking before we look at the answer choices. Again, this is how you use selective intuition. All right, Megan, we're ready to go to the choices?
Yep.
All right. So if Freeman is charged with attempted murder, he will most likely be found. And again, we're going to have 2 guilty probably and 2 not guilty. So think to yourself, is he guilty of attempted murder or not? And then we'll narrow it down. A says not guilty because the plane could not take off. B says not guilty because his plan to kill was inherently impossible to execute. C says guilty even if he did not intend to kill Fed. And D says guilty because he had taken the last step he had to take to make the plan operative. All right, so the first step here is to ask yourself, do you think he's guilty of attempted murder or not? And then you have to look at the 2 choices that connect to that. Does that seem like the right way to handle it, Megan?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. C should say did not intend to kill Scribe. I don't know why it says Fed.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah. Sorry. C, guilty even if he didn't intend to kill Scribe. Let's see what happens here. Ready? All right. A said not guilty because the plane couldn't take off. That would have been a really tempting answer, better, and it's wrong. Factual impossibility is not a defense to an attempt. Remember, we said if that happens, the defendant is guilty of an attempt. So factual impossibility refers to a situation in which the intended act is criminal and a crime would be committed if the defendant were successful, but the defendant can't accomplish the crime because of facts unknown to them at the time they act. Well, in this question, we've got a situation of factual impossibility because Freeman would have succeeded in the crime of murder, but for facts that were unknown to him, which were bad weather. Can't be a not guilty problem. I think we know already that in this situation, we've got Freeman as being guilty. So let's see what happens here. Answer B said not guilty because the plan was inherently impossible to execute. All right, so let's look at inherent impossibility. This would be a defense to an attempt, but it refers to a situation in which the defendant intended to commit a crime, but they chose means obviously incapable of bringing about the criminal act. And the reason that works is that the defense negates the element of attempt, requiring the defendant have the apparent ability to complete the crime. So again, think of my example of shooting an arrow at an airplane. In this case, deceiving the victim into operating an airplane that had been altered so as to crash, that's not an impossible or an infeasible method of killing. And in fact, it might have worked if not for intervening events. So B is incorrect on the facts. So in this situation, we now know that we're in the guilty part of the world. We're down to C and D. Answer C says guilty, even if he did not intend to kill Scribe. So to be guilty, the defendant must intend to commit the crime which they're attempting. So if the intended crime is one requiring specific intent, then that intent is also a prerequisite to the crime of attempt. So murder is always a specific intent crime, and for attempted murder, there'd have to be an actual intent to kill. So guilty, even if he didn't intend to kill Scribe, isn't going to work. Okay, so now that leaves us with D. And again, everybody on the chat box, you guys are brilliant. D says guilty because he'd taken the last step he had to take to make the plan operative. So as we've said, an attempt requires a substantial step in the direction of committing a crime. And you have to have the intention to commit that crime and the apparent ability to complete the crime. So we're back to the definition of attempt. The substantial step test that we mentioned at the beginning requires the legal conclusion that the defendant's conduct went beyond mere preparation into perpetration. So you're going to commit the crime. So a defendant who's done all that they need to do to perpetrate the crime has always gone beyond the preparation stage. So Freeman did perform the last act required on his part in order to realize his plan to kill Scribe, and therefore has clearly taken a substantial step towards perpetration of the crime and therefore guilty of attempted murder. All right, so D is correct. Whew, that's a lot, huh?
Yeah, hopefully that made sense to everybody.
Yeah, I'm glad that we could talk through this. And congratulations to all of you that got it. I think that's awesome, and certainly what we were hoping for. Megan, any last thoughts here while I get myself back?
So good luck, everyone, with your studies this week. Like I said, if you got some bad news this week from the bar examiners, keep your head up, keep working. Let us know how we can help you. I'm just really proud of the effort that I've been seeing from everyone who I've been working with. Super proud of you all. Keep it up, right? It's only May. I know the exam feels like it's a long way off, but this is the time when future you is going to really appreciate that the you of today has kept moving forward. So keep it up.
Absolutely. I hope everybody has a good study week. Megan, thank you for being here, and hope that this was a helpful discussion, and we will be back to you next week. And I don't know, have we picked a topic for next week yet, Megan? I don't think
No, not yet. So it'll be a surprise for you all.
Put your suggestions in the community group. Let us know if there's something you want us to cover, and we will see you all next Wednesday. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening and watching the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at celebrationbarreview.com.